So fairy tales, Cinderella, Aurora, Snow White, Belle. What messages are we given in fairy tales about how relationships work? In some, finding one another is hard, right? Villains will tax us. But once we find once we find one another, cue the happy ending, white wedding, and credits. Finding the one will make us beautiful. Princes will rescue the damsel in distress. Even that finding the right pair of shoes will somehow do the trick. Okay, so leaving aside the Barbie bashing, even, acknowledging that none of us are ever really gonna look like that, even leaving aside the independent woman agenda, I will simply state that I am a proud self-rescuing princess and leaving it at that. But that still leaves us with the question, what messages are we given in fairy tales about how adult relationships work? What expectations are we taught here? What messages are they sending to princesses who long for a princess of their own, or who long to slay the dragon or ride their own white horse, or who happen to fall in love with the serving girl and the stable boy? Some of us wanted to be the princess. Some of us wanted to rescue the princess. Some of us wanted both. And most of us grew up in a world that was very quick to tell us whether it was okay for us to want these roles, okay to want something different than the fairy tale, than the story that was played out for us again and again in books, movies, magazines, and even romantic music. Here's the real problem I see, though. It's more with what I wasn't told. Not only that I wasn't told that it was okay for me to want any and all of these things, but also that none of my favorite stories really told me what happened after happily ever after. What models are we shown for how to make relationships work? How did these fairy tale couples learn to argue? How did they learn to make up, to share responsibilities, to get their very different individual needs met? I don't recall any of my fairy tale stories that picked back up the day after the white wedding and happily ever after. So what models are we all left with? Did we have to learn how to make relationships work from watching our parents? How many of us actually saw all the work that our parents put in to making their relationship work? The same with other people's relationships. How many of us actually see all the work that people put in to make things work interpersonally? What is represented to us as normal? Sadly, these days, what is statistically normal is divorce. And oftentimes, the thing that is most noticeable to a child is when things go wrong, the raised voices, the fighting. So where were our models for success? So, in the course of trying to learn these answers in my own life, I was also establishing my career as a psychologist specializing in the areas of sexual, gender, and relational diversity. What that means, particularly the latter, is that I work with individuals who choose to structure their relationships based not simply on what is expected of them by society or history, but based on a deliberate agreement between all parties involved, be that two people or more than two people. Polyamory, and more inclusively non-monogamy, refers to the ethical practice of maintaining more than one romantic relationship at a time, with the full knowledge and consent, and that phrase is very important, the full knowledge and consent of all partners. This is actually not a new concept, but recent explosions in media attention, along with the explosion of social media, which I know we're all so aware of, has established more and more communities of individuals supporting one another in this relationship orientation. Because the concept of polyamory is based on an arrangement that is inherently different from the stereotypes, different from what we all saw in our fairy tales, these types of relationships rely heavily on good communication skills, radical honesty, and the willingness to actively work to make relationships function. Because polyamory represents a change from expected relationships, it also requires a reassessment on an individual level of our expectations for relationships. What do relationships mean to us? Who takes what role? What constitutes cheating, and so forth? Sometimes this is even the first time that individuals have asked themselves, do I want something other than the fairy tale? Is that really what's going to work for me? The first time they have dared to consider that they may want something different. This may lead to new conversations about the division of labor in relationships. Who takes on what role in social settings? Who takes on what role in decision making? And yes, sometimes who takes on what role in the bedroom? But it means that we cannot live unaware. We cannot rely on fairy tale tropes. We have to know our own minds and desires, and we have to be willing to communicate those to our partners. What a scary thought, huh? So, as I have immersed myself in this world, I have discovered something wonderful. Polyamory has something to teach monogamy. Not that either one is preferable. Every individual has to decide for themselves what type of relationship works best for their life. But polyamory has a powerful message for monogamy about expectations. Don't. And about communication. Do. As a clinical psychologist and a therapist, I've been trained to believe that communication is the way forward. Communication with ourselves and with others. Pretty much any course on relationship therapy will tell you that. But where is our popular model for good relationship communication? Movies and television tend to focus on conflict. It's entertaining, often funny, and it moves plots along, but it rarely models health. So where can we learn about radically honest communication? I would invite you to pick up any book on polyamory. Communication is the theme. Honesty, openness, self-reflection, the willingness to have difficult conversations, to speak unspoken truths no matter how scary, courage in the face of doubt, feeling the fear and doing it anyway. As a therapist, I am constantly aware of the terribly seductive power of doing things the way we have always done them, doing things the way we expect them to be done. Often this feels incredibly safe. It has served us so well in the past. It has kept us safe. But I also have firsthand experience of the power of looking at those expectations, looking objectively, looking from our new adult perspective, and seeing the ways in which they may be holding us back, or the ways in which we mistakenly believe that everyone has the same expectations that we do, that normal means the same thing for every other person. So here's the idea that I would like to share with you today. Monogamy can learn from polyamory. Allow me to disclose for a minute. Yes, I am a therapist. Yes, I am biased regarding good communication. My whole job pretty much centers on it. I spend my days asking people to tell me their truth. Yes, I think more communication is pretty much the answer to everything. But note that I am not just talking about talking. Certainly all of us have had the experience of two people talking to one another and not really communicating, right? By communication, I mean active listening, true engagement, and the willingness to hear the other and to empathize with their experience. All of those skills can be learned. It was pretty much my whole first semester in graduate school. So I'd like to share an example with you. A client once explained to me that he, a cisgendered heterosexual male, was ending his friendship with his female best friend. When I asked why, he looked at me like I was an idiot and simply stated, "I'm getting married." I looked at him similarly befuddled and said, "Okay, I'm going to need a little more explanation." And he explained that it was not okay for him to have a female best friend, particularly once he was married, despite the fact that there had never been anything even remotely romantic between himself and this best friend. I continued to ask some questions here, and then I discovered the really interesting part. His new wife did not hold the same expectation. She had said nothing to this individual about changing his interactions with the best friend with whom she had seen him maintain a friendship through the 4 years that they had been courting. His decision to end his friendship was based on a belief that he had, a belief that married men could not have friendships with individuals of the other sex. So where did he get this idea? Well, a little further investigation determined that he got that idea from his parents, who held that belief so strongly and saw friends outside the relationship as a possible threat and a source of sexual competition inevitably. Ultimately, in this story, there was no issue of cheating. There was no issue of jealousy. What became an issue was this mistaken assumption that had never been discussed, an expectation that was not held equally on both sides of the relationship. The woman that this man was marrying had no intention of changing her relationships, her friendships, nor did she have any expectation that her fiancé would either. But he assumed that this was what was normal. He assumed that this was how you made a marriage work. I hear this story of assumed expectations over and over and over. But how can we know what another person is thinking? How can we know what are their expectations? What is their normal? The only answer is communication. So here is my idea. Forget what you know. Don't abandon intuition or feelings or signals from partners. Still pay attention to people. But don't assume you know what those mean. Ask them. Talk to people. Have conversations. Have them by text if they're difficult to have in face-to-face. Find surveys if you have to, but avoid assumptions at all cost. Which brings me back to this area in which I live and work. Where do we get the assumption that married, straight monogamy is the normal or right way and the only right way in which to have a relationship? That it is what everyone wants or everyone should want? And that if we find the one, that we will magically know how to make it work with no apparent effort? That if it is the right one, it will not be difficult? I can only speak for myself. And I feel like a traitor to my 8-year-old self in saying this, but I don't want the fairy tale. I want a rainbow spectrum of relationships in my life, many relationships, running the gamut from acquaintance to intimate friendship to romance and true love. And the only way that I can know what the others in those relationships want is by communicating with them, by finding out through conversation and true empathy with the other, by asking each of them. The only way that I can make those relationships work is by having the difficult conversations, by clarifying my mistaken assumptions. And yes, I will make mistakes. I am going to have to be willing to be wrong. I am going to have to admit when I am wrong. And I'm going to have to be willing to ask rather than to assume. Sadly, fairy tales failed to teach me that. They taught me that a shoe, or a pea, or a fairy godmother was going to somehow tell me when things were right. And that when I found that right thing, everything was going to be happily ever after. Well, I have happily ever after, and I have a newsflash. Happily ever after only happens if you are willing to work. To work to understand yourself in relationships. What do you want? Who do you want? What is a good fit for you? to work to understand what people you meet want, not magically, but by asking them and by finding ways to talk about the things that are scary, to work to compromise when those needs compete. So here is my idea. Forget the fairy tales. Write your own. Forget what you think your relationship should look like. Spend time discovering what are your unique wants and needs in a relationship. What do you want in a partner? What do you bring to the table as a partner? What do you need as an individual? Forget what you think others want in relationships, or what you guess, or feel, or intuit they need. Forget what the fairy tales have told you, or the sitcoms, or the romantic dramas. Ask your partners to talk to you about their expectations and desires. Abandon assumptions. Embrace curiosity without expectation. Customize and communicate your expectations. Be willing to be wrong. Be willing to be different. Be willing to be weird. You can trust me. It's quite fun. And be willing to do the work to make happily ever after happen for yourself. Thank you.